Chapter 18, Midnight in Merry Hollow. The town square of Merry Hollow was a vision of Christmas perfection. Twinkling lights adorned every surface, their warm glow reflecting off the freshly fallen snow. The air was filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine, mingling with the excited chatter of the townsfolk gathered for the annual Christmas Eve ceremony. As the clock struck 11, the master of ceremonies, a jolly elf named Jingle Bellsworth, stepped up to the podium. His voice, magically amplified, rang out across the square. "Friends, neighbors, dear citizens of Merry Hollow. Welcome to our most cherished tradition, the Christmas Eve ceremony." A cheer went up from the crowd, and Holly felt a pang in her heart. How many of these people, she wondered, had any idea of the danger that lurked beneath the festive surface? From her position near the great Christmas tree, Holly had a clear view of the entire square. She scanned the crowd, noting the positions of the other Guardians members they had identified. Noelle was there, standing with a group of other toy makers, her face a mask of cheerful excitement that didn't quite reach her eyes. Across the square, Jack had taken up his post, his icy presence camouflaged by a clever glamour spell that made him appear as just another festive reveler. Their eyes met briefly, and Holly felt a surge of determination. Whatever happened tonight, they were in this together. The ceremony began with the traditional carols, the entire town joining in a magical harmonization that sent shivers down Holly's spine. Under normal circumstances, she would have lost herself in the music, in the pure joy of Christmas magic. But tonight, every sense was on high alert, watching for any sign of the Guardians' plan unfolding. As Silent Night drew to a close, Holly noticed something odd. Several of the suspected Guardians members were moving through the crowd, their movements too purposeful to be casual mingling. They seemed to be taking up positions around the perimeter of the square, their hands hidden in the folds of their festive robes. Holly caught Jack's eye again, giving a subtle nod towards the suspicious activity. He returned the nod, his hand moving to his pocket where she knew he kept one of Tinker Bell's magical alarms. The carols gave way to speeches, with various town dignitaries taking the podium to share Christmas wishes and reflections on the past year. Holly only half listened, her attention focused on the movements of the Guardians and the steadily building magical energy she could feel emanating from the great Christmas tree. She noticed Frosty, Snowman positioned near the edge of the crowd, his coal eyes scanning the square with ancient wisdom. Peppermint, her young apprentice, was weaving through the crowd, distributing Holly's specially enchanted cookies. Each treat was designed to subtly reinforce the town's natural magical defenses, a precaution against whatever the Guardians had planned. As the speeches continued, Holly became aware of a growing tension in the air. It wasn't just magical energy building up, there was an almost palpable sense of anticipation, as if the very fabric of Merry Hollow was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to occur. Finally, it was time for the main address, traditionally given by the mayor. But with Mayor Kringle's tragic demise still fresh in everyone's minds, it fell to his deputy, Cornelius Candy Cane, to deliver the speech. Cornelius stepped up to the podium, his usually jovial face solemn. "My dear friends," he began, his voice ringing out across the hushed square. "We gather tonight in a time of great change and challenge for our beloved Merry Hollow." Holly felt her pulse quicken. There was something in Cornelius's tone, an undercurrent of tension that seemed at odds with the festive occasion. For centuries, we have been the guardians of Christmas spirit, keeping alive the magic and wonder of the season in a world that too often forgets its importance. But times are changing, my friends. The world outside our borders grows darker, colder, more in need of the light we keep burning here in Merry Hollow. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the usual light-hearted Christmas Eve address they were accustomed to. Tonight, Cornelius continued, his voice rising with passion, we stand at a crossroads. We can continue as we have, content in our isolated paradise, or we can embrace our true destiny, to spread the gift of eternal Christmas to a world desperately in need of its magic. Holly's eyes widened in shock. Was Cornelius openly declaring the Guardians' intentions? She glanced at Jack, seeing her own alarm mirrored in his face. As Cornelius's speech continued, growing more fervent with each passing moment, Holly became aware of a change in the magical atmosphere of the square. The energy emanating from the great Christmas tree was intensifying, pulsing in time with Cornelius's words. She scanned the crowd, noting with growing unease that many of the townsfolk seemed entranced by the speech, their eyes glazed over with a magical sheen. The Guardians members she had been watching were now moving with more purpose, forming a loose circle around the tree. Holly's hand tightened on her wand, ready to act at a moment's notice. She could feel the magical protections they had put in place earlier straining against the growing surge of power. Whatever the Guardians were planning, it was big, far bigger than anything she had anticipated. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Holly's witch's intuition screamed a warning. Something was about to happen, something that could change Merry Hollow, and perhaps the world, forever. Suddenly, movement near the base of the tree caught her eye. A hooded figure was approaching, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost inhuman. In its hands, it carried a small, glowing object. The snow globe, Holly realized with a jolt of fear. They were already making their move. Without thinking, she began to push her way through the crowd, trying to reach the tree before it was too late. But the press of bodies, many of them swaying in a strange, trance-like state, made progress difficult. Across the square, she saw Jack reacting to the same threat. But before he could move, one of the Guardians stepped into his path, blocking his way. Holly was still too far away. She wouldn't make it in time. In desperation, she raised her wand, ready to cast a spell, any spell, to stop what was about to happen. But before she could utter an incantation, a blast of icy wind swept across the square. Startled cries arose from the crowd as a sudden flurry of snow obscured their vision. Jack had created a distraction, using his ice powers to buy them precious seconds. Holly seized the opportunity, charging forward through the disoriented crowd. She reached the base of the tree just as the hooded figure was placing the snow globe into an elaborately carved recess. "Stop!" Holly cried, her voice nearly lost in the growing chaos of the square. The figure turned, and Holly found herself staring into a pair of familiar eyes. Eyes she had known all her life, eyes that had always twinkled with Christmas cheer, but now burned with an otherworldly light. "Mrs. Claus?" Holly whispered, disbelief warring with horror in her voice. The kindly face of Merry Hollow's beloved matriarch twisted into a smile that held no warmth. "Oh, Holly dear," Mrs. Claus said, her voice honeyed with false sweetness. "You always were too curious for your own good." Before Holly could react, Mrs. Claus raised her hand, a bolt of searing magical energy leaping from her fingers towards Holly's chest. Time seemed to slow. Holly saw the bolt approaching, knew she should move, but her body felt frozen in shock. This couldn't be happening. Mrs. Claus, the heart and soul of Merry Hollow, the embodiment of Christmas spirit, how could she be behind all this? Just as the magical attack was about to strike, a wall of ice materialized in front of Holly, absorbing the blast. Jack was at her side in an instant, his face grim with determination. "Holly, are you all right?" he asked, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Claus. Holly nodded, unable to find her voice. Around them, the square had erupted into chaos. The spell that had held the townsfolk in thrall was broken, and panic was spreading as people began to realize something was terribly wrong. Cornelius's voice boomed out from the podium, magically amplified to be heard over the din. "Citizens of Merry Hollow, do not be afraid. What you are witnessing is the dawn of a new era for our town, for the world." But his words were drowned out by the growing roar of magic emanating from the great Christmas tree. The snow globe, now firmly lodged in its recess, was glowing with an intense, pulsing light. Waves of magical energy were radiating outward, causing the very air to shimmer and distort. "We have to stop this," Jack said, his voice tight with urgency. "If that spell reaches its full power, it could tear the fabric of reality apart." Holly nodded, pushing aside her shock and there, at the heart of it all, stood Mrs. Claus. Her hood had fallen back, revealing her familiar face transformed by an expression of triumphant ecstasy. She stood with her arms raised, channeling the power of the snow globe into the expanding spell. "Why?" Holly couldn't help but cry out as they drew closer. "Why are you doing this?" Mrs. Claus turned to her, and for a moment, Holly saw a flicker of the warm, loving woman she had known all her life. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Claus said, her voice carrying even over the magical tumult, "can't you see? The world has forgotten the true meaning of Christmas. We're going to remind them. We're going to save them all. But not like this," Holly argued, her voice cracking with emotion. "Christmas isn't something you can force on people. It has to come from the heart." For a moment, doubt seemed to flicker in Mrs. Claus's eyes. But then her expression hardened once more. "You're young, Holly. You don't understand the weight of responsibility we bear. Sometimes, hard choices must be made for the greater good." With a gesture, Mrs. Claus sent another blast of magic towards them. This time, Holly was ready. She raised her wand, calling forth every ounce of her baking magic. A shield of gingerbread and frosting materialized before them, absorbing the impact of Mrs. Claus's spell. Jack seized the opportunity, sending a barrage of icy projectiles towards the snow globe. But they dissipated harmlessly against an invisible barrier surrounding the artifact. "It's no use," Mrs. Claus called out, almost pityingly. "The spell has already begun. Soon, the entire world will know the joy of eternal Christmas." But Holly refused to give up. As she racked her brain for a solution, her eyes fell on the faces of her fellow citizens. Some were still caught in the thrall of the Guardian's magic, their eyes glazed and unfocused. But others were beginning to shake off the spell, looks of confusion and fear replacing the artificial cheer. And in that moment, Holly knew what she had to do. "Jack," she said, gripping his arm tightly, "I need you to boost my magic. Can you do that?" Jack nodded without hesitation, placing his hand over hers on her wand. Holly felt a surge of icy power flow into her, mingling with her own warm, festive magic. Taking a deep breath, Holly began to sing. It wasn't a spell, not in the traditional sense. It was a simple Christmas carol, one she had known since childhood. But she poured every ounce of her belief, her love for Mary Hollow, and her understanding of the true spirit of Christmas into the words. Slowly, hesitantly at first, other voices began to join in. Pepper Peppermint, her young face streaked with tears and frosting. Frosty, Snowman, his deep, rumbling tones a counterpoint to Holly's clear soprano. And then more and more, as the citizens of Mary Hollow began to remember who they were, what Christmas really meant to them. The song swelled, a wave of genuine Christmas spirit rising to challenge the artificial magic of the Guardian's spell. Holly felt the power building, not just around her, but through her, as if she were a conduit for something far greater than herself. With a final, triumphant note, Holly directed all of that power towards the snow globe. There was a moment of resistance, a feeling like pushing against an immovable object. And then, with a sound like 1,000 bells ringing at once, the barrier shattered. The snow globe exploded in a burst of light and magic, sending Mrs. Claus and the other guardians stumbling backward. The column of light flickered and died, the expanding spell faltering without its power source. For a moment, everything was still. And then, slowly, snowflakes began to fall. Not the eternal, unchanging snow of Mary Hollow's magical winter, but real snow, delicate and ephemeral and utterly beautiful. As the citizens of Mary Hollow looked around in wonder, Holly felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She leaned heavily against Jack, who wrapped an arm around her shoulders to support her. "We did it," she murmured, scarcely able to believe it herself. Jack nodded, a tired but genuine smile on his face. "You did it, Holly. You reminded everyone of what Christmas is really about. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the town square in a fresh layer of white, Holly knew that Merry Hollow would never be the same. The road ahead would be challenging, as they learned to live without the magic that had defined them for so long. But looking around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, seeing the real joy and wonder in their eyes, Holly felt a surge of hope. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, truer to the real spirit of Christmas than ever before. The clock had struck midnight in Merry Hollow, and the world would never be the same again.